All right, so if you've been a member or here any long, you know this to be true, but I'm just going to point out, we teach through books as they come up. If you're visiting here, sometimes a church has a reputation for asking for money. When we got here, we were 9 months behind in rent, and we used to pass a plate. The first thing we did was take up the plate and put up a little box, and nobody knows how to give here anymore, and that's how we like it. We want you to have to figure it out. Today, we're going to talk about wealth, and we're going to talk about God's attitude on wealth. Jesus speaks more than others on the issue of money. It's not that he needs it. It's not that he's so concerned about that as much as the aspect of that your wealth shows where your heart is. Where you spend your money shows what you think about his provision, about things in life. And so we're going to talk through the text. We'll read it and then come back to it as usual. It should be fairly short, famous last words of every pastor everywhere. But it should be fairly short today and straightforward. We're going to end chapter 4 of the book of James. If you have a device or a pew Bible, you can turn there, and we're going to go through chapter 5, verse 6. Let's read, and then we'll come back and look at it. Starting in James 4:13. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into this or that town and spend a year there and do business and make a profit. You do not know about tomorrow. What is your life like? For you are a puff of smoke that appears for a short time and then vanishes. You ought to say instead, if the Lord is willing, then we will live and do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows what is good to do and does not do it is guilty of sin. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. Father, open our ears to hear, our eyes to see, our hearts to receive, and Father, our hands and feet to walk in obedience. Every time we look at your word, may that be our application. And it's in Christ's name we pray. There's a framed blueprint on a wall of a modest home. It was drafted by the previous owner and yet now deceased. It remains to remind his wife, his children of the dreams they had. 40 years of planning and looking towards a time that would never come. The beautiful property which the plans were to have been built upon, the site sits empty in testimony of inactivity. A dream never to be realized. 40 years of 40 to 60 hours a week, apparently an American, justifying the sacrifice for the future. 40 years of cutting corners for the sake of this future dream. Putting in time on weekends, chasing the next promotion, forsaking self and the delight of a day for a moment that was yet hopeful but never to appear. Unable to enjoy the moment or the generosity of the present, not receiving nor giving in generosity, but chasing a comfort that would never come. A blueprint, occasionally now dusted, looked upon, reflected with soft smiles from a wife that remembers the planning and the hope, but is just left there on the wall. How many of us live in a serving, self-sufficient planning mode? Do we trust in the present or future wealth in ways that we shouldn't? Are we modeling faith or forsaking it for self-made, merit-based living? Is living with this self-motivated mentality expressing what we truly believe? And maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but it definitely shows what we truly believe today. Verse 13 picks up in the book of James, chapter 4. Come now. He's going to say this twice. And what he's saying is come, look, reflect, perceive, learn, be changed. And that's really why we do observation, interpretation, and application of the Word of God. We want to see what it says, we want to know what it means, and then we want to apply. A lot of times we just get fat-headed. We see what it says, we know what it means, then we close and walk away. Our job in church, our job in devotion, our job in home group, application, application, application. Okay? And that's where we're driving for tonight, to come, or today. Come, look, and be changed. I said I wasn't going to go that long, so it shouldn't be tonight. Come, look, and be changed. There's an attitude of self-sufficiency. I grew up in that attitude. Texans, we are known for pulling our own boots up and buckling up and getting on and going. Okay? I have to learn to resist this. Because even though I believe in a sovereign God, sometimes I feel like there's a distance and I've got to make it happen. And most men that I meet struggle with this, ladies as well, in other ways perhaps. The assumption is I am in control. It's up to me. It's up to me. Get up, get out of bed, get it done. Come home sweaty, shower, repeat cycle. Okay? And you can live long lengths of time in that cycle. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into this or that town. So here's a businessman. Here is somebody who thinks that they know the future, that they're going to go spend a year, do this business, make a profit, gather those profits, come home and spend them on their delights. All of this is not necessarily bad. Not necessarily bad. I remember Pastor Mill speaking at a college group and him asking them, just upright, like, what are you studying? And they all gave, this or that, because they were all in the university, in their 4-year plan, predicting their futures by what? So why are you studying that? Well, I'm good at math, so I'm going into accounting. I'm very visionary, I'm going into business. I love science, so I'm doing that. And his next question was, did you ever pray? Did you ever pray about that decision that you're committing 4 years to? Or did you just naturally flow into it? Would you do that with a wife? Would you do that with a major purchase? Would you do that in major life changes? And unfortunately, a lot of us would say, yeah, I do it based on my rationale, my common sense, the circumstances in front of me. I put all these things together. I make my pro and con sheet, and I determine my pathway. And what separates us from the world when we do it that way? Nothing. Nothing. Nothing at all. And in reality, we do have these gifts. We do have these skills. And God is typically going to give you your heart's desire and things that you are made to do. They don't just flow from you for no good reason. They flow from you because God has placed them there. But He's placed them there for purposes that are maybe bigger than my next 40 years, my retirement plan, my blueprint in the sky. Okay? And that we need to not live self-sufficient, dependent lives. We need to be radically different and giving things back to the Lord. Because you, verse 14, do not know about tomorrow. What is your life like? I used to run with an elite crowd of athletes, and there was this one guy who was professional. He was the Texas State triathlete. He had gone to Ironman and done really well there. He's swimming in a pool at a gym that I worked at. He's doing just another day of laps, 33 years old. We had to pull him out of the bottom of the pool. Just married Linda, had a bright future in front of him, had made these plans, and they were gone. They were gone. And you too have friends, family, stories that just seem like things got shortened a little quicker than seemed likely. Life is frail. We do not know about tomorrow. We may look like we're the most fit person in the world. And just a little thing, one little chemical imbalance, one stupid cell called cancer enters in, and the whole equation's off. What is your life like? For you are a puff of smoke that appears for a short time and then vanishes. You ought to say instead, if the Lord is willing. And it seems like such a small thing. It really does. You'll see me end certain letters. If I write you, I'll put DV, du volonté, God willing, or I'll say God willing or something, because I know my thoughts are we are going to take this mountain, conquer it, build upon it, and we are going to create our kingdom. I love creating. I love conquering. But when I do it by myself, it's not good. I've shared this illustration. It's one of the lowest points of my life, but I've shared it before, where we went to Latvia right after the wall came down. It was my fourth summer in there. We executed, because now I'm a professional missionary. I know how to do this. I set up the plans, the strategy. I had laid out where we were going to do, what we were going to do for 6 weeks. We were turning it over to this leadership team that I had brought along. I was going to head out and be gone. And I get on the train after 12 weeks of doing that, thinking, man, what success. We accomplished everything on my checklist. And as the train pulled away, with all my fans sitting there on the train station waving goodbye, thank you for coming, blah, 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 God just spoke, because I was on the train alone. And he just said, and where was I? Where was I? Yeah, I may have used you. I may have done the things that you had planned out. We may have seen people come to Christ. You may have built up the church. You may have, but you know, in that Corinthians passage where it says wood, hay, and stubble and all that's going to burn, it may look good to these people waving. There ain't no crown in it for you, my friend, because you were living independently outside of me. You had gotten enough popular votes in your own head that you could do it on your own. It was like kissing God goodbye in the morning and heading off to work. I had my devotionals every day while I was there, but I was living in a way that wasn't devoted, and it was outside of Him. You ought to say instead, if the Lord is willing, then we will live and do this or that. Father, here are my plans. I lay them before you. Change them if need be. Jen and I, we have a retirement program. We kind of laugh at it, because Jen laughs at me, because I never thought the life I lived I'd ever make it to 20. 30 was a real long shot. And here I am at 60. When the church hired me, they said, you have to give into this plan. I said, why? I'm not going to be here for it. And they said, yeah, but if you get hurt, we're not going to take care of you, so you need to have something that will. I said, okay. But you give it back to the Lord. You say, Lord, I'm doing my best to plan. I'm trying to think about the future in human ways, but if you need this to be redirected, if you need to take this away, if you need to shove it somewhere else, it's not my life, but it's yours. Less of me and more of you. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. Proclaiming independence displays an arrogance. And that arrogance, such boasting, is evil. It's wrong. It's sinful. It's worldly. It's living outside of Him. So whoever knows what is good to do and does not do, it is guilty of sin. And this is it's a trap. You're in entrapment right here. God's saying, hey, you shouldn't do this. Now you know you shouldn't do this. And if you do this, it's wrong. All right? There's a guy I would recommend you following him. His name's Paul Tripp. He does a Wednesday write-up. He does blogs. He does everything else. But this Wednesday is funny because it was on James 4:13-17. And he called it divine interruptions. That God comes in and interrupts our plans in good and tough ways. But that He has a nature about Him that knows exactly what is best. I look at Eric and I see him suffering through the last 3 years, and it's crazy. And yet, if I back up, Eric's faith has grown astronomically. He used to kind of follow my mother around in her faith, and then she died, and he was left there. And that death caused him to step into his own faith. Him stepping into his own faith caused this amazing growth. I've got this bracelet on my arm from when everyone he talks to in Kingsville, Texas, he's got one of these on and he'll talk to them about it. And it just says, God has great plans for your life. Simple, nothing too profound. But if they respond at all, he's got one in his pocket, he pulls it out, and he invites them to church. He's got nurses, bankers, and other people going to his church because he has become active in his faith. He's not Charles Spurgeon. He's Eric Bandelow. And he's being faithful in a way that matters. Whoever knows what is good to do and does not do it is guilty of sin. Remember James 1:15, he says, our desire leads to sin, and sin leads to death. Instead of boasting, we should be seeking His will and giving things back to Him. Then as the chapter turns, it really doesn't. Remember, the chapter numbers and verses came later. It's really the same thought, from an independent living to, hey, let me get to your pocket here. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. And notice he's got the come again. Come, look, consider, reflect, be changed by seeing the truth. That wealth can bring pain if you're not holding it loosely and giving it firstly to His will. That these miseries are coming today in overconcern or tomorrow in judgment for mishandling. Your riches, verse 2, have rotted. Your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded. So riches rot, are ravaged, and they ruin. Riches do not last. You do not carry them into heaven. But you know what? You can send them ahead. The Bible is very clear that if we use our time, talents, and treasure for things that build into eternity, we're actually sending forth into eternity our good works that He has caused us, Ephesians 2 says, for us to walk in. That He has purposed us with our gifts and our talents to walk in these good deeds. So when we come to Him with our gift and talents, with our open hands and say, okay, you've given me this, how can I use this? Then it goes from rot, ruin, and ravage to eternal blessing, honestly. And again, it's a small distinction. You don't have to deny your talents. You don't have to deny your ability even to make money. You don't need to deny your ability to build large kingdoms. But when Nebuchadnezzar does it and boasts on his own, he's knocked down to a beast. That we are to do things from God, for God, intentionally seeking His will in it all. Riches rot, ravage, and ruin. They do not last. They will eat you alive. They will eat your flesh like fire. Consumption. You have laid up treasure in the last days. And this picks up the imagery of the New Testament. The New Testament always talked about the second coming of Christ, about His imminent return. And I think in certain ways what that means, even 2,000 years later, is that we need to be living in the attitude of an imminent return. That I am investing not in long-term vision for this, that, or the other that's going to rot, ruin, or be ravaged, but I am investing with a mentality for the eternal future. I'm doing things, investing where I can make God glorified. There's a guy, LeTourneau University is named after LeTourneau, and I believe it's Tyler, Texas. He's got several universities throughout Latin America. He's built hundreds of thousands of churches. He's done food programs, building programs, you name it. He's one of those guys who's 9 digits into, he's dead now, but he had probably 9 digits deep in income, and he chose to live off of 1% of his income, which is still more than I'll ever see. But to give away 99% to doing things that would enrich humanity, that would bring God glory, and to make Him known. That's a crazy generosity. And maybe we won't be endowed with that much material blessing, but can we do it with the little? Can we do it with the portion that we've been given? Jesus, the church, honestly, it doesn't need your money. It needs your attitude. It needs your change of worldview from being worldly to being otherworldly, from being temporal to being eternal. And money doesn't decide that, it just reflects. It's like getting an EKG. Is my heart healthy? I've got this silly watch that I'll do a little ECG most nights just to make sure things are well, because I've reached that age and I've had a couple of weird moments there. And so it's just telling me, am I healthy now? And our checkbooks, our spending, our debt is just a measure of that spiritual health. Hoarded wealth rots, misplaced trust in wealth will end in destruction. Behold, verse 4, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. So those who work to give you bread, you are keeping bread from. That you're withholding just payment. You're being stingy, not generous. You're not paying workers fairly. There's an injustice. You fight for your minimal profit margin instead of being seen as one who generously gives, pays correctly, and cherishes those who work for them. You have lived on the earth in luxury, and you may say where you're at, have you seen my bills? Have you seen my whatever? You have no idea. But I hate to tell you, if you sit right here, unless you're just visiting from somewhere way far away from us, if you're from the West in any sense of the world, you're in the top quarter, if not top 10% of wealthy people in the world. How do we do it? If you remember back in Exodus, when they were being fed by manna, those who gathered too much didn't have too much. Those who gathered too little didn't have too little. Why? Because when they gathered and they got back with their omers, it's a measurement, bucket, think bucket of manna, those who had too little, the ones who had too much, gave off the top. That if you kept it until the next day, it was full of worms. And in a real way, that's an imagery for what we're supposed to do with our material blessings. That we are blessed to bless others. We are not blessed to stack it in our garage and then into our storage shed and then into whatever. We are blessed to be a blessing. Whether in little part or large part, God entrusts different people differently. But we're all called to be a blessing, to find ways to not live luxuriously, but to live generously. That we aren't to be living gluttonous in the midst of a famine for other people. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. People are dying. And we're toasting. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. That we live in excess while denying the poor. We find reasons to justify our actions. You know, we think, I'm not going to give because they're going to spend it on whatever. I had a car breakdown. When I was in undergrad, I had to take the city bus. Austin, Texas is a little wild if you haven't been there. I'm waiting for the bus. Young man, 30-ish, comes up to me and says, hey man, I'm not going to lie to you. Will you give me a dime for a beer? And I'm like, dude, you show me where we can get a beer for a dime and I'm buying, okay? And I just started talking to him. Instead of waving him off, and I don't do this all the time, but instead of waving him off and saying, get out of my face, what is your deal? And he shared his non-faith testimony for the next 30 minutes on the bus with me. And I just got to love on him a little bit. Was he a drunk? Probably. How did he get there? He had made some really bad choices. But was he a human? Made in the image of God? He was. He was. And don't let their outward appearance reshape your thinking for the poor. I'm not telling you to just go throw your money at people who are going to use it poorly. But I'm saying don't just to hold it back because you have this mentality. Break the mentality. Walk into their lives. See who they are. Maybe you can help. All right, some applications. Submit your plans to God. Number one. Don't plan independently. Acknowledge God's authority in your decisions. As you get up in the day, there should be a moment where you pause and say, Lord, this is my plan today. Is this really what you want me to do? Because when I start off with my 10 to-do list, and then I get a phone call from someone who is going into the hospital, I'll struggle. I'll need to struggle with, okay, is this more important or is this more important? What am I allowed, as Paul Tripp says, to be my divine interruption for the day? Okay? Pray and seek His guidance in your career, your relationships, your daily choices. Everything you do, He wants to be involved in. He does. Submit your plans to God. Number two, use wealth for eternal purposes. Wealth is not evil. But hoarding it, misusing it, not being generous with it, that's evil. You have been crazily blessed. Bless someone else. Don't gather too much. Don't hoard it for it to rot. Be generous and invest in what lasts, God's kingdom and helping others. Thirdly, live justly and compassionately. Treat others with fairness, kindness, especially those in need. That when Jesus talks about real ministry, He talks about the oppressed. He talks about the widow and the orphan. He talks about those who have a lesser hand than many of us do. and that looking like Jesus is leaning into their lives and coming closer, even if it looks, smells, tastes a little bit awkward. That's okay. Can you imagine being God divine, leaving heaven and coming to earth? You want to talk about interruptions? There's an interruption. And that interruption ultimately served us, not him. That interruption caused the distinction between belief and unbelief. That interruption brought redemption in the form of salvation. That interruption may have seemed to be an inconvenience when it first crossed your path. Who's this guy and why is he sharing from this little pamphlet to me? Or I don't have time to listen to this. But then when your eyes and ears were opened and your heart was conformed from rock and stone to softness and life, it made all the difference. And all James is asking us to do here is to live consistently with that divine interruption, to not put our plans higher in priority than God's. That we are to submit our plans to God, use our blessings for his purpose, to live in a just and compassionate way to others. That we are to live with a God-centered perspective, surrendering our very lives for him. You may have a blueprint. I'm okay with that. I like to dream. I imagine sailing across the Mediterranean one day in a boat that I own. Maybe, maybe not. It's okay. It's okay to have that dream. But I hold it loosely. I hold it presented to God as if you so will. Why is that passion here? Is it selfish? I don't know. Honestly. But I give it to him. We need to live today asking him what to do with this day, this time, this talent, this treasure. How can I best impact eternity? Am I concerned about that as much as where I'll spend my last 20 years and what I'll be doing? Not guilt, folks. It's a worldview change. And the reason we put our heads into this word is so that it will change us. That we live in a world that tells us this is what's right. This is what's real. And we've got to break through that and step into his way and his will so that we can understand that there's a better way for me. That I'm actually going to be more fulfilled in his will. That I'm going to feel more content, more blessedness, as he said on the Sermon on the Mount, by walking in a way that isn't death or destruction. I'm going to have that blueprint. But by walking by faith towards a future that I enjoy generosity today, and I will enjoy it abundantly tomorrow. Come, look, reflect, understand, receive, be changed by his way that is definitely different than the world's way.